Live everywhere on netrootsradio.com. David Waldman, Kagro, in the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It's Wednesday, and that's all you really need to know. Wednesday, May 24th, 2023. Time for another show. Time for me to try to think of some sort of offhand comment about the numerology of today's date, and I can't think of anything, so that's fine. And we roll forward. Okay, how are things going for you today? Have you thought of a show intro? What about that, huh? Hey, smart guy, you think this one was crappy? I don't know. All right. Well, at any rate, yes, lots to talk about today. Oh, Justice reminds me, I think I had managed to forget. Sleeping overnight was not interrupted even once by thoughts of murdery Trader Green spending $100,000 for a tube of used Kevin McCarthy chapstick. I really... was sort of put off. I would have been put off my breakfast had I remembered. Now, of course, I've already eaten my breakfast, and I'm put off of having another one, I guess. One, by the radio show, and two, by the thought of what a weird thing to do. And I guess, what was it? Is it for raising money for the NRCC, I suppose, and how she has the $100,000 to spare. Well, a bunch of idiots give her a lot of money for going to the floor and saying dumb stuff a lot. So, all right, I guess the money ends up where it's supposed to be. I think we can blame her for inflation now, though. I mean, I think single-handedly. I don't know how they prepare the stats for that, but the price of chapstick, used chapstick at that, went up to $100,000 plus. Because I understand, by the way, in reading the tweets from the reporter who revealed this disgusting information yesterday during the show, stomach-churningly enough, but Joan saw it, brought it up, ruined my lunch, and apparently, though, the sweetener to the deal, not just that it was cherry chapstick, not just that it was campaign-branded chapstick from some House Republican that McCarthy just happened to have around, and I'm sure they offered it as a joke. They were just looking to get a bunch of money, and they did get that. But then I guess McCarthy threw in that he would appear at a fundraising campaign event for you or some candidate of your choice, I guess, if you were the winning bidder. And that was enough to get Marjorie Trader Green out of her seat. So how do you like that? Okay. Oh, yes, and I actually know both of the stories today. I happened to see this one earlier in the morning just in scanning. I didn't put it aside. But Justice reminds us that there's the inaugural poems terrorizing kids in Florida. Yes, I believe that the poem read, and I think was by a young teenage poet. Was it the poet herself that she had written something original? Was she reading someone else's poetry? I can't recall exactly, but I recall that she did a fantastic job in presenting this thing. And that the poem read at Joe Biden's inauguration. I remember watching it just to make sure that it happened and everything. And that poem, I guess, has now been banned in Florida because I'm sure, if nothing else, I don't really remember the poem except that I was impressed with it and the presentation of it. But it must make mention of someone who isn't white, or perhaps just that it was written by someone who wasn't, or read out loud by someone who wasn't white, and that's enough to trigger CRT fears in Florida, and we got to get rid of it. I'll get the actual story for you at some point, or at least I will. I don't know whether I'll read it, but I'll dig around. We'll see whether it's among Greg's Raft O stories. That's a growing list. And, I'm scanning it. I don't think so. And I don't even think the chapstick story is in there either. But I don't know. That's disturbing enough all by itself. And the fact that it actually happened is rather incredible. I have been monitoring an interesting exchange between economist Justin Wolfers and noted idiot J.D. Vance. But, of course, J.D. Vance thinks he's a genius. And an interesting exchange in which Vance, not surprisingly, given that he's a Republican and a slimy one at that, was attempting to make the argument that I guess what he was trying to say was even normies should be angry about immigration in this country because, in his view, with all of these people coming into the country, now they all need housing, and that was driving housing prices and rent up because, simple economics. And so therefore, if all these people weren't there, there would be less demand for housing, the price would come down. It's all the immigrants coming into the country that are driving rents higher. And Justin Wolfers, an economist, kind of decided maybe it would be worth pointing out that there's actual numbers on this stuff. And here's a chart showing how much rent has gone up over time. And here's a chart showing how immigration has progressed over time. And with the crackdowns that we've had, because Republicans demand them, immigration is still happening. People are coming into the country, but net immigration rates are actually slightly declining. And it's, difficult to connect a metric that's actually declining to one that's actually skyrocketing. And if there's any relationship at all, it would seem that an influx of immigrants, even a small one, or at least a decline in the growth of immigration, really, if it's creating a housing problem, then maybe it's something you want to address. Now, one way of addressing it, of course, is to meet the demand and to build those houses. But it was an interesting exchange. It didn't go all that well for Vance, although you know how it is. It's one of those frustrating ones because he thinks, he pwned the whole economics community by telling, that's interesting. And, oh, yeah, well, fine, sure. Show me the difference that legal immigration is making. I bet that this doesn't count illegal immigration. And Wolfer's pointing to I just read the footnotes for you, by the way, of the source of our information. And yes, it's in there. And you don't believe it because your story is that billions and billions of people are flooding into the country daily, jumping out of planes with parachutes and tunneling their way underneath the ocean and whatnot. And the real problem here is that your assumptions are completely false, and it's like talking to an AI chatbot. But that's always been the case. Even before we knew about AI chatbots, talking to J.D. Vance was something like, as it turns out, talking to an AI chatbot. Just sort of make up what parts of the argument that he needs in order to make things look right, but that don't actually exist, he invents along the way. That's kind of the story of the origin story of J.D. Vance. All right, Greg Dworkin is here. Maybe you want to entertain us with your own origin story. If there's something, if there's gamma rays or spiders or anything involved. Greg, how are you this morning?
Hi, not in this particular case. I'm still fascinated by the Tucker Carlson origin story.
You know what? You and Matthew
where
Rington.
Where he went to CPAC and said something reasonable, and they booed him, and he said never again, and became what he is.
Well, he's got a similar story. He's sort of like the Robin to Trump's Batman. He went to a rally and said vaccine, and boo, all right, never again. I'm not going to help anybody avoid COVID anymore.
Right, exactly. So I thought that was interesting. The funny thing about the Justin Wolfers J.D. Vance story.
Did you see it? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is the exact charts that were involved.
Yes.
J.D. Vance tweeted on an Axios story. The Axios story is the change in U.S. rent and income growth since 1999, showing that rents are going up faster than income growth.
Yeah. I mean, it was a story about rent.
Yeah, that's it. Okay,
Right.
J.D. Vance took that, and the relationship between rent growth and income growth is what he used as the basis for his tweet, where he said, letting in too many people drives up housing costs for normal Americans. Stop Biden's border crisis. Stop his war on home affordability. Now, nothing in the Axios chart says anything about immigrants, Biden's border crisis. And by the way, the right is really upset that the ending of Title 42 did not lead to a surge of zombie immigrants on the border, climbing into your bedroom and over your garden walls and into your gated communities. Except to mow the lawn. They're really
hanging out with
upset
Antifa.
that there wasn't a surge. So Fox is reporting as if it were.
All right.
But all the networks, NBC
We have
Nightly News,
footage of a surge.
Sorry. They all had people stationed on the border just to show what would happen, and it didn't happen. And they're still really upset about it. So Justin
Weather
Wolfers took
Channel.
all of this. In other words, Vance was making it up. and said, Senator, I have put together the chart showing the two variables you were trying to link, which is rent growth and immigration growth. Rent growth goes up, immigration growth goes down. There is no relationship.
Yeah,
that's why it was so good.
That's problematic. And so, there's all this insistence that Vance, keeps going and keeps digging, and it gets worse. And as he says, Wolfers offers him, all right, well, look, here's rent growth versus total population growth, and then versus the U.S.-born population growth, and then shades the space in between. As the U.S.-born population growth is plus 13.9%, total population growth plus 17.9%. That little narrow band between 14 and 18, that 4%, that's immigration. Rent growed. Let's just do it that way, just to be more intellectual about it. Growed 90%, 89.8% over that time. So probably not your factor, but AI chatbot, yes, it is.
Yeah, well, so all of that's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Now, today's big news, of course, is twofold. There's the debt ceiling crisis, and then there's the announcement of Ron DeSantis running for president.
Oh, yeah, that was a huge surprise, wasn't it? That was cool.
So that was the topic of my pundit roundup this morning. Ron DeSantis takes the expected plunge.
I hope he wears the boots.
Well, there were some interesting responses to it. In particular, there was this story in the New York Times, DeSantis' allies, 20 million plan for beating Trump. And, it's interesting. DeSantis allies. DeSantis word allies, ALLIES apostrophe. DeSantis allies is 20 million plan for beating Trump. Now, do you put an S at the end of allies after the apostrophe, or just apostrophize it? That was how they got around with DeSantis with that. Right? They didn't say DeSantis' 20 million plan, because then they couldn't figure out whether to put an apostrophe or an apostrophe S. Oh. But the gist of the story is that he has a ton of money.
Okay.
And reminds me of when Phil Gramm ran for president as chair of the banking committee and said, I'm going to steamroll over anybody because money, 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 money. And, of course, he got clobbered. A key political group supporting Ron DeSantis' presidential run is preparing a $100 million voter outreach push so big it plans to knock on the door of every possible DeSantis voter at least 4 times in New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina.
Well, New Hampshire, that's not even fair to say.
And 5 times in the kickoff Iowa caucuses. So if you want to knock on the doors of voters, you just go to the House in New Hampshire, because every voter is a member of the House, and you just do it there. But the thing is, they're spending a ton of money to do this outreach.
1 ton of money.
And, probably $10 million is going to pay the people to knock on doors, and $90 million is going to Ron DeSantis to keep him away from anybody's door, because to meet him is to hate him. And so that's really his underlying problem, which, by the way, is summarized very well by Joe Walsh. Now, as it turns out, in order to make this big announcement, Ron DeSantis skipped Fox News, skipped your basic press conference, which would invite normie news.
Oh, yeah.
And he's going on Twitter to do it with Elon Musk, not as a video, but as an audio.
Oh. Hello.
I'm
here with Elon Musk.
Is this on? So Joe Walsh says, he could launch his campaign on Twitter. He could launch it on Fox News. He could launch it on Facebook. He could launch it with a big speech in a big football stadium. He could launch it in his house. He could launch it with a mouse. He could launch it on a boat. He could launch it shouting across a moat. He could launch it in a tree. Nice. He could launch it sipping tea. It doesn't matter where or how DeSantis launches his campaign. The more people see of him and the more they hear from him, the less they like him. That's his problem, not where he launches his campaign.
Yeah.
Which is absolutely true.
They all should wear the boots. Like, instead of the orange hats, they'll all wear the white boots.
Yeah. Ben Smith over at Semaphore says, this is a real slap in Fox's face. DeSantis' decision to announce on Twitter is a slight to Fox News once the unchallenged central force in conservative media. Musk's exclusive is the latest in a series of moves to pull the platform in the direction of a conservative audience, a shift that could pay off in the currency of attention.
Yeah.
Not those, because everything Musk does is genius, and it has to work. Why don't you just assume it won't work and then, work from that rather than assume.
Yeah,
well,
I guess that would have been a better foundation, I think. I always love eating attention. Pays for everything.
More recently welcome Tucker Carlson, who will host his new political talk show on Twitter.
Right. Allegedly.
So great. We'll see how well it works.
Okay, everyone.
I mean,
when
cars
you think Twitter,
aren't going
you think
to put
television.
AM radio in it anymore, so they have to do something.
Oh, yeah. Right. That's true. I don't know if anybody's going to miss that or not, but we'll see. We were promised flying cars. Instead, we got regular cars with less radio in it. I don't know how that happened.
Well,
Elon
radio
Musk.
with less flying.
Yeah, I guess so. Does Elon Musk, does he have an accent of any kind? I don't think I've ever heard him speak.
I don't know.
I was just wondering about
can't
that.
recall.
Okay, well, I've never heard him, and
I don't think he necessarily
going to. Well, I guess it's all audio, so we would find out if we listened. But I don't imagine A, that I would, and B, it would never occur to me. Let's get some audio from Twitter. What? No.
Right. Meanwhile, just a reminder that Ron DeSantis isn't the only one who's running.
All right.
And by the way, Sarah Longwell also noted.
Is she running?
That when she was doing her focus groups,
yes,
Ron DeSantis was more popular than Trump among people who voted for Trump twice until Trump got indicted, and then it flipped.
That is something.
Matt Lewis notes the same timing and says one bad sign for DeSantis is the more his presidential campaign looks imminent, the worse his polling. And so there's a chart there just showing that DeSantis is the green line. It's just, it drops. Trump is much more popular than DeSantis at this particular point in time. Now, Trump has his own legal issues. Maybe we'll get into that a little bit. But today the focus is on DeSantis and other people running.
All right.
And there was a very interesting piece in the Bulwark about the whole idea of Tim Scott running, because he's another.
Yes, he's running.
Right. And in the process of Sarah Longwell talking about her focus group and the fact that they really prefer Trump more than DeSantis these days, one observer on Twitter noted, part of the problem is that in MAGA world, in Trump world, those folks actually hate establishment Republicans almost as much as they hate Democrats.
Grr.
So that's a real problem. So if there's a story in the New York Times about Ron DeSantis, or Ron DeSantis lets the New York Times interviews him, or all of this stuff, Twitter's fine, but everything other than Twitter that's like regular news is actually anathema to the very people that Ron DeSantis is trying to attract. And so you step back and look at the bigger picture there, and you have Sonny Tim Scott, your Ronald Reagan Republican, who nonetheless still supports Donald Trump in every way, shape, and form.
Strangely. Yes.
Said, Donald Trump is the biggest voice of the party. He gets to decide the direction. And I was there on January 6th, and it was terrible. It was awful. It was every bit as bad as everybody said. And the one person I don't blame is Donald Trump. This is Tim Scott.
Okay.
Right?
Good luck. I mean, it's your head. If it explodes, I can't help you.
Right. So Scott says, I'm the candidate the left fears the most. I'm the black candidate who affirms your racial innocence, in other words. And a bonus, the left hates me, so I scratch your partisan itch at the same time. So that's Scott's shtick in terms of running. This is being written by Tim Miller. And he says, is that unjust to Scott? Perhaps, though somebody once said, no matter how cynical I get, I just can't keep up. Here is Scott, the breath of fresh air, the neo-Reaganite on the events of January 6th. And I quote, I was in the chamber when the rioters were coming over. I was taking my jacket off, my tie off, rolling my sleeves up just in case I had to fight. The chances of me understanding and appreciating the severity of the situation is 100%. The one person I don't blame is President Trump.
Okay.
And here is his 2022 response to Maria Bartiromo on whether he'd be open to the VP spot. I think everybody wants to be on President Trump's bandwagon without any question. One of the things I've said to the president is he gets to decide the future of our party and our country because he's the loudest voice. If you're keen to prove America's not an evil country, maybe start by ruling out running with or even voting for a truly evil figure. But Scott's not doing it. No. And so the idea behind all of this is that somehow or other, the people who want culture wars are going to embrace Sonny Tim Scott is like zero. The whole rationale behind his running isn't there.
Yeah.
But if he's running for vice president, maybe some of this makes it a little more sense. And I'm sorry, this wasn't written by Tim Miller. This is written by Mona Charen.
Oh, all right.
All people in the Bulwark.
I guess that makes more sense, perhaps.
She used to be a Tim Scott Republican.
She did?
And now can't bring herself to vote for any Republican.
Well, that's wise.
Which is
for her,
why she's at the Bulwark, of course.
Yeah, I guess so. How interesting.
Right. So meanwhile, there was a big story in the Washington Post, concerns about Biden's reelection swamped by fear of Trump in swing voter focus groups.
All right.
And I don't remember if we covered this on Monday, but if we did, it's worth going over again. Whatever the step above panicked is, that's what I feel about Trump, said one of the voters. And they're talking about concerns about Biden's age. But as the focus group moderator steered the conversation to the possibility of a Biden rematch next year with Trump, the mood clearly shifted. 9 of the 15 people who they interviewed all had cast a ballot for Trump in 2016 and then Biden in 2020. 9 of the 15 said they'd vote again for Biden. 3 said they'd go back to Trump, and 3 said they wouldn't vote for anybody.
Interesting.
Even a 32-year-old recruiting manager for Phoenix who had described the panic she felt watching Biden came back into the fold. Whatever the step above panic is, that's what I feel about Trump.
Okay. Whoops, clunk.
So this isn't a Sarah Longwell focus group. This is the Washington Post's own focus group. People don't like focus groups, but then again, they don't like polling. They don't like,
True. Yeah. They should like focus groups better. It's polling with snacks.
Both of them are the same thing. Focus groups depend upon the moderator and depend upon who you pick for the focus group. But neither of them are predictive of what happens. What they do is they give you some information so you get a better sense of why things are the way they are. Or if you will, polling will tell you the way things are as of today, and the focus groups will tell you why that is. Now, that neither of those are predictive, and people get mad at them because they're not predictive. Well, I heard that focus group 9 months ago, and look at how the election turned out. Well, they're not meant to be predictive of what's going to happen in the election, just telling you what's going on at the time. And today is at the time, today. So, let's talk about today's focus groups and today's polls.
Okay, I mean, that's fair enough. It shouldn't be taken as, well, none of it should be taken as predictions, but it's hard not to accidentally or improperly take a poll as some sort of a prediction. But the focus groups, I think, even less so, since it's such squishy stuff.
Well, another point Natalie Jackson made on Twitter about polling is that when you're looking at issues polls and not horse race polls, you have to have a sense of the questions being asked. And it really, in a way, if you interpret it properly, gives you a sense of what's going on with the public. And she uses as contrasting examples, on the one hand, polling about the debt ceiling. Now, the American public doesn't really understand the debt ceiling. And you can tell that because depending upon wording of the poll, either Americans would be happy with raising the debt ceiling as long as spending is cut, or Americans want the debt ceiling raised whether or not you cut spending.
Okay.
Depending upon how you word the question, whether they understand what the debt ceiling is.
All right.
Because in abstract, Americans always would like to cut costs and get rid of waste and,
why not?
And that sort of thing. But in practical matters, if you tell them what they're going to cut, they say, no, not that. Cut something else.
Okay.
Government needs to spend less money. Okay, we'll cut Social Security. No, not that. Cut this other thing that I don't care about.
Yeah.
And so when you get different responses to a poll about whether or not the debt ceiling is important and whether, it should just be raised or whether it should be raised in context with also decreased spending, depends upon wording, but it's sort of inchoate because Americans, when it comes to a topic like that, are aspirational. Aspirationally, we would like less spending by the federal government.
Oh, Americans.
Practically speaking, of course, not the stuff I really care about. Just do something else. But contrast that with any polling you do on Roe Dobbs. Doesn't matter what the question wording is. It doesn't matter what the question wording is on background checks for guns.
Oh,
These are incredibly popular things, and no matter which poll, no matter what questions, no matter what order, you get the same answer.
They are things that people have either innately understood or taken the time to understand.
That's the point.
Oh,
so if you look at a poll like that, you go, okay, well, the American public really understands the gun issue, and they understand the abortion issue, and they don't understand the debt limit issue, and we know that from polling.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't ask, do you really understand it? But by reading what the responses are, you really get a good sense of what's going on. That's where polling can help you. That's where focus groups can help you. Neither is, worth, well, I'm really angry because look at these two polls and they're stupid because they don't agree. Well, actually, they're telling you a lot if you just look at it right. Yeah.
Plus, there were snacks. And by the way, some grammatical advice. So if we were writing the headline about this, we could say, Americans' opinions is validity in about right, with the S apostrophe. Tim Lapham is written in.
Americans' opinions is about whether or not we should get rid of my precious or just mint the coin.
Yeah. Oh, right. That's true. That's back in the news, too. And,
we'll do that after the break.
All right. But, and everybody can think of nominations for who to put on the coin or what to put on the
Nathan
coin.
Nathan Tankus wrote, can you imagine if Biden pulled $1 trillion coin from behind Kevin McCarthy's ear on live TV? That would be like the greatest moment in American history.
Right. All he needs actually to do is to pull a case or two of chapstick and then trade it in.
Yeah.
That would probably cover the bills.
Well, he could sell the debt to Marjorie Taylor Greene first.
Yeah, that's right, too.
$8 trillion or whatever.
Throw in a visit. I saw a picture of McCarthy and Biden sitting together in the White House, I guess. It was very interesting and very telling for the body language type of people. Kevin really looked like he looked like the kid from
and Biden looked
Home
happy.
Alone.
He looked like a happy warrior.
Yeah, I mean, he was comfortable in his skin and sitting there, and like McCarthy doesn't really know how to sit in a business setting. It was very weird.
Hi, I'm Scott Anderson, the guy that writes the daily summary for this show, Kagro in the Morning. Thank you to everyone that supports this show. Many of you send donations through PayPal, Patreon, Square Cash, Radio Public, and so on. Some of you write your own essays and send them in, or read articles with your own commentary. We appreciate it. Now, some of you are listening to this and thinking, I'd like to help, but isn't there something I could do that wouldn't require money or effort? Why, yes, there is. You can just like us. On Daily Kos, they call it the recommend button. YouTube has a thumbs up. There are hearts and likes and love buttons. Tap our love button. Tap our love button every day. Share our shows and summaries on Facebook and Twitter, YouTube and iTunes, Stitcher and Amazon. Most of these places allow you to write a review, so a sentence or two would be great. Recommend us to social media, or tell your friends to listen to the show. You aren't just helping us, you're helping them find their new favorite thing to listen to. You could change the world. So thank you in advance from me and everybody else in the world.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. By the way, it does turn out that there is a very popular diary by The Critical Mind over at Daily Kos. You can find it on the front page because it's one of the more popular diaries. It's over on that right-hand gutter that runs alongside about the poetess whose work was banned in Florida because evil CRT. Biden's inaugural poem is banned by a Florida school by The Critical Mind. I'll include it in the roundup, but if you're super curious and you want to go find out now, don't wait and listen to Greg first and then go.
Well, I still don't understand all this upset and fuss about cathode ray tubes. It's just, it always really confuses me when I read that.
Right. Well, we're all into the flat screen thing now, and so, I wonder if that'll ever come back as a retro thing.
The way of skate keys, and
giant TVs.
Whatever the name is for that little yellow 45 adapter with the three arms.
Yeah. I don't know. They must have a name for that somewhere, but
they're in a drawer somewhere in my kitchen. Anyway, Astrid, writing for the New York Times, says, good morning.
Yes.
Which is very nice.
Good morning.
Challenges that Ron DeSantis faces in any presidential run go beyond boots. Donald Trump.
All right. Boots. Pudding.
Narrative 1.
Yes.
DeSantis is toast. The reality is opening for a Trump alternative, whether it's DeSantis or somebody else. Again, I don't think it'll be Tim Scott, as talented a politician as Scott is, and as much as people like John Thune like him. Everybody in the Senate likes him.
Okay.
Remember
That's
what I
nice.
said about GOP MAGA world hating the establishment, and John Thune is the establishment.
I guess so. I mean, that won't stop him from announcing that he's not, if necessary.
Right. But there is an opening. It's just that they don't really have anybody. It's not going to be Asa Hutchinson. And the problem is that anybody who's not Trump who gets nominated will split the party because Trump will take his people and he'll leave.
Yes, most likely.
So there may be an opening for a Trump alternative. After all, there's a lot of bad stuff that's about to happen to Trump and is happening to Trump.
Great.
Jack Smith, for example, is pretty much finished with his Mar-a-Lago stuff.
Excellent.
Yeah, he's looked into foreign contracts and whether or not the Saudis are paying money to Trump on his golf courses and stuff like that. But the Wall Street Journal basically says, after speaking with people in the Jack Smith investigation, they're not really sure there's that much there, even though they've recently investigated it, and that's been in the news in the last 48 hours. Fact is, they're just about done.
Okay.
And the Trump people are so convinced that Trump will be indicted that they're starting to prepare fundraising plans based on it.
Okay. Right. And
so
and
yeah,
getting
sure
everybody
he'll be
banned
indicted.
from Russia.
And
okay,
it'll
good.
probably be pretty soon, just so you know.
I hope they don't give up on the other stuff, and maybe Smith's recommendation can be, well, I really want to limit it to these things, but really, honestly, somebody could, maybe another special counsel later wants to look into the rest of this stuff.
Right. Well, there's so much.
Yeah. And I just don't want to let go on anything, but
yeah, but it's endless. You gotta
you have to let.
These are our strongest cases. We're going to do these.
It's best if he indicts on the one that people were
and what
waiting on.
Hey, listen, if he's guilty and it's a criminal thing, not a civil thing, and you actually do put him in jail.
Well, and you know where
what
he is.
What difference does it make if it's 10 years or 20 or 50 or 150? At some point, it doesn't matter anymore.
So I'd like to get to that point and make sure that we do. So put him away on what you have. That's fine. Another special counsel or a regular counsel, for that matter, can take care of it.
So Astrid Herndon writes, one route for a candidate like DeSantis or Senator Tim Scott.
Hey.
Or Nikki Haley, remember her? She's also running.
Oh, South Carolina, all over the place.
Who joined the Republican field yesterday, is to win the nomination without crossing Trump. I don't see how Haley beats Trump. Haley can't even win North Carolina or South Carolina.
Well, yeah, that would be the more important. I don't know. This is just, I guess, well, as your previous article mentioned, maybe it's all just, auditioning for vice president.
Yeah, as my colleague Nate Cohn
as
wrote,
usual.
One strategy for defeating Trump could be to embody his political message without taking him on directly. So that would be the DeSantis play. For some Republicans, this is a welcome direction. My reporting made clear that given the criminal investigation Trump faces, some rivals have banked on him to implode on his own. But that's a passive strategy, and it almost never works. That's me adding it. He says the strategy is passive, which could play into Trump's hands.
I see.
Okay. Narrative number 2, DeSantis' biggest problem is Donald Trump. And the reality is, but he has another problem to confront first. He doesn't scare away candidates who are once deferential to his status as a frontrunner in the Trump alternative sweepstakes. Last week, several Republican governors made notable moves. Doug Burgum, B-U-R-G-U-M, Doug Burgum of North Dakota.
Really?
Made overtures toward joining the 2024 field. Glenn Youngkin of Virginia released an advertisement linking himself to Ronald Reagan. Chris Sununu said he was thinking about joining. Days after a report that former Governor Chris Christie might join as well. These actions show a party unintimidated by DeSantis' candidacy and are further evidence his campaign's first task isn't to overtake Trump, but to persuade primary voters that he's the strongest rival. At the RNC meeting, a Trump advisor told me his campaign would love for the field to get to 10 candidates. More is better for us.
Yeah.
And that gets to the comment that somebody in the Trump campaign made, which is actually a pretty good comment, which is said DeSantis wants to claim his accomplishments. The only accomplishment he's had is getting other people to run for president.
Well, yeah, he's pretty good at that, I guess.
And that's because he's so weak that they said, we could run too. And that's true. It's actually right on point. One of the things when you make a dig at something is that when it's
JD
true,
Vance.
it cuts even more. And that one is true because, if the governor of North Dakota takes a
happening.
look at Ron DeSantis'
Oh, my
campaign
God.
and say, I can run too.
Really, the governor, if you're in a situation where, under any circumstances, the governor of North Dakota says, you know what, I'm a pretty strong candidate for president, that's a weak field.
Exactly right.
North Dakota.
And so that's
Welcome to
why,
the show, everybody.
you go back to, okay, there are concerns about Joe Biden's age, but they pale in comparison to the actual, who's he running against?
All right. That is interesting. That's a lot of entrance into the race. You know what? Speaking directly to Republican primary voters now, so many of them are listening to this show. I think the solution is obvious. When you get your ballot in wherever you're voting, vote for as many of them as you want. You just mark as many of those bubbles on that sheet as you like. There's no reason you should not be free to do that. Hand in your ballot.
Primary.
Yeah, choose everybody.
Anybody can run.
Just fill in as many bubbles as possible, and or as many as you like. Don't let anybody tell you that it'll invalidate your ballot and your vote.
No,
won't
because
count.
Republicans embrace IRV, ranked choice voting.
Right.
They love it. So
in
go
fact,
ahead
just
and
write
vote.
numbers all over your ballot.
And even though it's not official policy yet, why don't you send them a message by letting them know it's a good plan? So go ahead and do it.
Yeah. So jump right in. Do
Totally
that.
valid.
Democrats,
I mean, they do it in
I'll give you
Alaska,
your
they do it in
instructions closer to the contest. You stay tuned. But yeah, it's going to be interesting. I wonder if they're going to start demanding some sort of way of, if anybody's going to inspire Republican primary voters to say, I'd like some alternative method of voting here, I guess it would be Donald Trump. I mean, I don't think it's going to work, and they won't understand it, and whatever. Okay, but don't let anybody restrict your freedoms.
We're also decreasing the chance that Donald Trump will actually debate these clowns.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I don't
Why
think
should he?
there's any real chance, right? So,
I mean, on the one hand, he hates to pass up a camera, and on the other hand,
Yeah.
why should he?
right, and he can rent his own camera and go talk to that and pretend he's raising money for veterans and then keep all the
he'll
cash.
do the fake seal of the president and that sort of thing, and who's going to say he can't because it's his own network or whatever? OAN isn't going to say no.
No. All right. Well, I think that's a good that's a prediction for the future, even though this is
He won't
not
go on Twitter to
polling
do
or.
it.
I don't think so, but I guess I was reminded that he has an exclusivity agreement with Truth Social,
And
which
he's still
I guess
mad at Twitter for blocking him in the first place.
yeah, and I'm
Even
not
though he's
really
been
clear
unblocked. He doesn't
on
go on Twitter.
his having
And
an
Twitter
exclusivity
is now,
agreement with himself.
Ron
but-
DeSantis' network.
Yeah. Oh, right. And Tucker Carlson, who loathes him or something like that. So we'll see. But he might not be able to pass up the audience. He might think he'll take it over.
Yeah.
He
Oh, by
might
the way,
think Elon Musk will love
speaking
him.
speaking of the media landscape,
Yes.
Jennifer Rubin had really excellent piece
Are you sure?
the other day.
Okay.
I am sure. CNN needs a new chief. Here's the ideal candidate with a huge picture of Christine Amanpour.
Oh, okay. Well, I would take her as the head of the network.
Yes,
Sure.
exactly. The calamitous and widely panned CNN town hall with disgraced former President Donald Trump personified much of what is wrong with the mainstream media. The insatiable desire for sensationalism, the dereliction of duty to pursue the truth, infuriating passivity, and the normalization of lying and political extremism. Now, she herself is an MSNBC contributor.
Rubin?
Which she lists as
Okay.
a disclaimer.
All right.
Nearly as bad the expected corporate defensiveness that followed, including CNN chief Chris Lick's chewing out of media reporter Oliver Darcy
right, yeah,
for
okay.
exhibiting the temerity to do his job, which is to say media criticism, and discussing his employer's
Okay.
errors in providing an uncontrolled forum for Trump's assault on reality.
Yes.
Lick's alleged encouragement of Trump to have fun, his refusal to acknowledge a fundamental error in presenting Trump in this fashion should disqualify him from management of a major news outlet, and she offers Christine Amanpour. We went over Amanpour's detailed critique of CNN the other day, but it was really quite good. And yeah, if CNN wants to right the ship, she'd be a great person to lead them, but they won't because she's into journalism and news as a profession, a professional journalist.
Yes, and you need to have some sort of business expertise or something.
Well, not only that, just it reminds me of the old Rune Arledge days. when Roone Arledge was appointed to combine the news and entertainment division, because why not?
Sure.
Because it's all kayfabe.
Yeah, go for it.
It's all nice thing.
Yes. Well, she would, of course, restore the integrity.
She would object to that. She
Yes.
would say, no, the news is the news, and you have a standard, and both sides-ism isn't it.
Yes, and then people would want money, and
yeah, so there's no chance that she would be appointed. But
okay.
Jennifer
but it was a
Rubin
fun
makes
thing
a good
for
point.
Jennifer
She's
Rubin to
actually
do.
what CNN needs. It's just that CNN doesn't know it.
Well, she's from MSNBC. What does she know?
Yeah, exactly. Well, from the Washington Post.
Oh yeah. Okay. Well, that would be fun. We could alternatively put her on the $1 trillion coin. Maybe that would be enough. But running CNN would be great. Well, how about Mother Teresa? Oh yeah. Oh, she's not available. Yeah. All right. Well, it's a fun idea. If you don't have a column,
I guess
go with that. I don't know. I feel this pressure every day. I can understand that. This is talk about what's ever on your mind.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, speaking of what's on my mind,
What?
Next is the debt ceiling debacle.
All right.
Remember the pre-cave, and people are still upset that Biden hasn't caved yet. Now they're upset that he's negotiating.
Well, sure. It's upsetting.
And the question on the table is what is he supposed to do? Really?
Yes.
Can you do the 14th Amendment? Sure. What's to prevent the Republicans from bringing up a challenge to the 14th Amendment either in Mar-a-Lago, Florida, or in Austin, Texas, or wherever it is that you guarantee to get Matthew Kaczmarek, and they go drug shopping, judge shopping, and they get immediately the relief that they want by picking the right judge.
They think they do. I'm sure, and they could do that, and they could get it, and then there'll be an appeal, and
but all that stuff will take time. In the meantime, they get what they want because these negotiations are going on, and it has to be settled by next week.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one problem with the 14th Amendment. The coin is still there. Biden looked at all of that and said they're gimmicks. People are mad at him because he boxed himself in, as Dave Diane put it.
Yeah. Okay.
But Biden's looking at it and saying, but this is reality. You can want all these weird things.
Yeah.
But none of it's reality. It's not what the markets accept. It's not what the world accepts. You may like it, but that's not going to help us. So what we're going to do is we're going to say we're not going to negotiate on the debt. We will meet our obligations regardless. We'll find money somehow. But we will negotiate on basically the outlines of a budget because we have to, because Republicans won the House. That's their job, and you really can't get around that.
Yes.
So that's basically how he's looking at it, as if this is a normal situation. The problem, of course, is Republicans have absolutely no interest in negotiations. And every single time the White House says, well, here's a compromise that could work, Republicans say, no, in fact, here's three other right-wing things we want to throw on top of the pile. And every time the Democrats say, well, we can do this, we can't do that, but what about on your side making some, moves? Republicans say, no, absolutely not. Mm-hmm. We're not negotiating at all. There's a famous cartoon that I don't have at my fingertips.
It's not that famous.
Which is a Obama era. Obama on one side and GOP. Obama says, this is what we need to do. And the GOP says no. And Obama said, well, I'll tell you what. Let's see if we can find some common ground. And the Republicans said, okay, I'll move if you do. Mm-hmm. So Obama takes one step toward the Republican, and the Republican takes 9 steps away from Obama.
Right. We've moved.
I'll move if you do. And that's exactly what's happening with this negotiation. So Jeff Stein reported in the Washington Post, for example, asked Tuesday evening what Republicans were offering to get Democratic votes. Representative Patrick T. McHenry, Republican, North Carolina, gave a brief answer: the debt ceiling.
Okay.
That's their compromise. That's what they're getting.
Yeah.
And Democrats say, that's not a compromise. No. Your compromise is you're not shooting the hostage.
Right.
That's not a compromise. You have to make a compromise. And the Republicans are saying, no, we don't. And that's how come we haven't gotten a deal yet. Now, sure, it's Washington, and things always go to the last minute, and you need a hard deadline to get anything done, yada, yada, all that sort of stuff. But basically, the whole game for the GOP is they consider raising the debt ceiling their compromise.
Yes.
And you have to ask yourself, well, what's it going to take in order for them to understand, no, they have to give more than that? Is it the markets?
That might help. Yeah.
Their donors? What is it
maybe
that's going to happen? Does that mean we actually have to have a debt crisis in order to get them to understand what's going on? Are they that stupid?
Normally you would say no.
Yes.
But the answer this time is yes. Yeah. I mean, what you normally do is you write a bunch of newspaper articles and say, this is what will happen. They read it. They get scared. They say, I don't want it.
So some of the banking people and the bond people were chatting online on Twitter. And so, people seem to not really understand how big a crisis this would immediately cause.
Yes.
For example.
Even the articles about it don't really say.
Well, they say, do you remember Y2K? Do you remember all of that?
Yes.
Do you remember what the problem was?
Yeah. I mean,
the problem was that the computer systems weren't built to deal with a date beyond the year 2000.
Which was amazing because you only invented computers a few years before 2000.
Nonetheless, they hadn't thought that far ahead.
Relatively
and all
speaking.
the software needed to be changed.
Yes.
To accommodate the 20 that goes before 0000, because otherwise it was all 19, and it just sort of ran out. They had 1921, 1951, 1991, but they didn't have 2021.
Right.
20.
So when it
so they had to fix all of the software, which they did.
1900.
And there wasn't a crisis. But the point is, the software couldn't accommodate this simple thing, and the threat was that there was going to be a problem with every computer, with every operating system, with every program.
Yes.
Because it simply couldn't accommodate that.
Yeah.
All at the same time, which would have been a huge crisis. And so a ton of money and effort was put into preventing that from happening. That was what the Y2K thing was. People joke about it now, but the reason it wasn't a major disaster and catastrophe is because people took the time to fix it.
Yes. And
they did, and they did it well, and nobody remembers it anymore.
Right.
Well, now we're talking about the debt crisis. Imagine banks talking to each other, trading money around the world, instantaneous computer programs that allow people to track money and this, that, and everything else, bond prices, whatever. And none of them have built in, U.S. Treasury is now worth zero.
Yeah, that's not an option.
Because we just defaulted, and so how do you put that into the program? And are you going to write code that's going to fix all of that by next week?
No. Yeah.
So basically what they're saying is this is one tiny example of how the entire banking system can come to a halt if they actually default.
Mm-hmm.
We can't trade bonds.
Yeah, we can't trade anything.
We can't trade anything. The market crashes because the market can't trade. Among the things that could happen, that's just the small end of what can happen. So yes, it's a big deal. It is catastrophic if something like that happens. And sometimes, you step back and say, well, why don't you just let us default so that Republicans can get a taste of how bad it is, and that'll bring them back to the table. Well, the problem is that the catastrophic thing that happened may not be reversible in a day or two.
Yeah.
By saying, okay, we're back at the table and we agree to do it. So, the leverage to force Republicans to do stuff isn't there. Unfortunately, the tools to teach Republicans what it means also aren't there. And that's part of the problem. And that's how come they think they can get away with saying our compromise is to not shoot the hostage.
Right.
Take it or leave it. And basically that's what it's been. And until they budge, there's no deal.
Guess not. I mean, I don't know how else to put it.
Yeah, everybody assumed Biden would cave. They assumed Biden would cave.
Yes.
He hasn't. That's why there's no deal.
Yeah. But there are articles that say he did.
Pre-cave.
So there you go.
There's the pre-cave stuff, right? He hasn't
Universal
caved yet like I predicted he will, but we know he will in the end. So let's just get pre-mad at his pre-cave.
I guess so. All right. Well, I don't know what to tell you.
That's the thing. I think the way negotiating
collapse
is going right now, we don't know. Here's a piece from The Hill, which kind of summarizes all of this. McCarthy and Democrats temper expectations on debt ceiling deal. Basically, my prediction of what they'll do is they'll do a temporary, okay, let's kick it down the road a month and give us a chance to negotiate.
Yes.
Or maybe 2 weeks. Maybe they'll have a tighter deadline so they can actually get stuff done. But Democratic and Republican leaders on Capitol Hill, you can read this article because it says Democratic. It doesn't say Democrat. Democratic and Republican leaders on Capitol Hill are starting to temper expectations among their members about what a final debt ceiling bill could look like, becoming more explicit and acknowledging that neither side will get everything it wants. That's been the frustration for Democrats trying to negotiate with a weak leader like McCarthy. McCarthy will tell the press everybody's going to have to give something, and then you say, okay, well, what are Republicans giving? And they say nothing. Yes. Well, you just said that both sides. He said, yeah, both sides. They give something and we give nothing. That's both sides.
They both gave. One gave nothing.
Well, one gave ground. The other gave an answer. I told you we both had to give something.
Okay, right.
When asked Monday whether any ultimate deal to cut spending as a condition of raising the debt ceiling will lose votes on both left and right, Speaker McCarthy indicated it would. Mm-hmm. Did you ever think at the end of the day you're going to get into a negotiation with both sides and only one side's going to carry everything? No, nobody thinks that. That same day, Hakeem Jeffries said he was willing to consider a White House offer to freeze spending at current levels, a stance that's drawing ire from liberals. Though Republicans flatly rejected the offer, it shows how far the White House has moved in discussions with Republicans in a matter of weeks as pressure mounts to secure a deal. I don't know that that's true, but that's your perception of how you've been covering this.
Okay.
Politics watchers had long expected the eventual deal to lift the debt ceiling to fall somewhere between what the two parties are demanding, but McCarthy and Jeffrey's statements are the clearest signals yet that their members should prepare for a compromise that jettisons party priorities. The tempering on both sides comes as negotiators say they're having productive meetings but remain apart on key issues, which a Treasury Department spokesman says could come. The fall could come as soon as June 1st.
Yes, that's
now. Even with Democratic support, any deal McCarthy makes will have to win support from a large majority of the House Republicans in order for him to keep the confidence of his conference and his gavel. So it can't pass just by a couple of votes, in their view. If it passes by just a couple of votes, McCarthy's done as Speaker.
You think? All right.
So he has to have a big vote. It's going to require a conservative work product that fundamentally changes how we spend money in this country, Dusty Johnson of South Dakota said. I believe he'll deliver that. I believe we'll have the sort of overwhelming majority of this conference. I might go in for something like that if they eliminated one of the Dakotas and one of the Carolinas. I'm getting sick and tired of confusing which one's which.
Okay.
Especially the Dakotas. I'll compromise. You can leave North and South Carolina, but you got to get rid of one of the Dakotas.
All right. Or we could combine them and then split them again, East and West.
Well, why don't you do North Carolina and North Dakota as one state and South Carolina and South Dakota as another state?
Why not combine all the news into one state? Jersey,
right-wingers
Mexico.
lined up to support the Speaker to pass a bill that paired $1.5 trillion debt ceiling increase with around $4.8 trillion in deficit reduction. Remember, deficit reduction and debt are not the same.
No.
The measure was designed to get President Biden to the negotiating table, but members of the hardline House Freedom Caucus are pushing the Speaker to use every leverage and just basically get the whole thing done as is. And that's not going to happen. So, bottom line is we really don't know what's going to happen. We don't know who's going to give what. We don't know how the negotiations are going. The gossip sheets all report strictly Republican sourcing.
Yeah.
And we really don't know. And it's really frustrating trying to follow the gossip sheets because you really don't know what's going on.
No.
I'm not interested in how Republicans feel about it. I want to know how they're going to vote on it.
Yeah. I don't really know if among the many things that were said, I don't know that I agree that McCarthy needs a big margin of victory in order to keep his seat either. I think if he sneaks it by, he'll be selling that as an accomplishment.
That's what I say. And everybody will line it behind him because Republicans line up.
Yeah. I mean, they don't want to have another round of crazy voting with there being no speaker. And there's really no...
That's how I see it, but that's not how the conservatives see it.
Yeah, they want to hold that threat out. Otherwise, it's pointless for them to caucus together and push. Their whole leverage is in being able to remove him from the speakership. But then if you offered them the chance to do it, I don't know if they would really go ahead and do it. I don't know if they're ready to sit there with no speaker and suspend all work on everything else in order to have this same fight over and over again. So
anyway, let's just end on a happy note. This is from Politico. Trump's legal team seeks a meeting with Attorney General Garland amid indications Jack Smith's documents probe is nearing indictment stage.
Okay.
Right? That's a happy thought to end with.
I guess so. He's interfering in Justice Department, something. I just want to impeach him for that.
Well, Marcy Wheeler brought up that exact point.
Oh.
And said, if you're going to bring that up, you ought to mention the fact that John Durham complimented Garland for staying out of stuff.
Yeah, I guess. Why not?
So let Garland stay out of this too.
Okay. I mean, maybe he will. I don't know. I mean, what's the meeting going to be? Well, he's getting near the end. Yeah, he is. Well,
we want to persuade you not to indict him.
No,
that meeting's not happening.
No. All right. I mean, I don't know. Okay, they want to have a meeting. This is what they do. They have meetings.
We suggest that Trump's legal team meet with Rudy Giuliani first.
Okay.
And discuss Georgia with him. And after that, we'll meet with you.
Okay. Yeah.
But, of course, that one's not happening till August, so we got 2 more months to wait on that.
Time. Okay. And time. All right. So it's June debt ceiling, maybe. They're still not sure about that June 1st date. I guess they stick to that June 1st date.
And then August for indictment. But in between those dates, between the debt ceiling crisis and the Georgia indictment, will be the Jack Smith Mar-a-Lago indictment.
Aha.
So put it on your calendar.
Yeah, and far fewer congressional junkets to Russia this time, as they're all, some of them find themselves under weirdo bans that don't make any particular sense. That was an odd list of people on there, some of whom are dead now, and so they're definitely not going to Russia. So, all right, well, this is only Wednesday. This means we get another shot at digging ourselves out of the hole of confusion tomorrow. Great, Greg.
Maybe something will happen. Who knows?
Yeah. All right. Join the race. All right. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. I like that idea. Woke orcas, huh? All right. We'll take it. And, really whatever the orcas want at this point. They need to come to the negotiating table. Something. I don't know. $1 trillion orca coin. Actually, there's a cryptocurrency in there for sure. All right, let's see. Other things that we have to catch up on. As a matter of fact, maybe I should save this for tomorrow because it's something that reminds me that maybe I want to discuss with Greg. We'll skip my first story currently in pocket then and save it for Thursday. And instead, I don't know what. Let's see. There's a bunch of things that I wanted to share and no particular order in which I need to share them. So let's see. First of all, perhaps, what the heck? Let's go to this one. This was something I was thinking of reading yesterday. Dahlia Lithwick. And we're back on the issue of the Supreme Court. And maybe it's, there's no particular segue to it, but we did spend a little bit of time discussing things yesterday with Joan and the idea of whether, for instance, we agreed with folks like Ezra Klein that it was a bad bet, a poor risk to throw the settlement of any questions about, say, the constitutionality of the debt ceiling, whether you're using $1 trillion coin method or the 14th Amendment method, and throw it to the Supreme Court, which is so weird and crazy and right-wingy these days, and so seemingly uninterested in precedent and logic when it comes to getting what they want politically. But we had questions about what the Supreme Court really did want politically when it comes to the collapse of the world economic system. It's very difficult to know what they know and what they're willing to know about the likely outcomes of long-term outcomes of default. But anyway, that's what we were discussing yesterday. But this, a slightly different approach to Supreme Court issues of various kinds. I'm sure Lithwick wasn't looking at the debt ceiling per se, but part of her piece, apparently a part of a project of a couple of different pieces from a couple of their prominent writers over at Slate about the Supreme Court in general and how they were going to approach covering it. But this was an interesting piece, I thought. Imagine if the press covered the Supreme Court like Congress. Why, though? Well, it doesn't matter because you can't, can you, as the subheader here. Let's see what she's talking about here. I had a better idea of what it was yesterday when I parked the article in Pocket. Now I've forgotten, so it's going to be a fun surprise for me as well. So let's read together. They mention, of course, this little project they have going here. It says this is a part of Disorder in the Court, a week-long series on the legal press and the most explosive Supreme Court in generations, how we cover it, how we've failed, and how we can do better. We critiqued yesterday, again, for the 5 millionth time, how the press covers Donald Trump and how they're totally unprepared for him, as we were complaining on Monday about the Axios coverage of I guess what they were passing off as the Donald Trump 2024 platform / agenda, which was to say that he was proposing all sorts of absolutely insane science fiction dystopia sorts of things. And they were saying, yeah, but the reality check here is, well, how's he going to pay for it? As opposed to reality check, he is campaigning as though he were Vermin Supreme and saying that he's going to build futuristic cities with flying cars and Judge Dredd cops and build them from out of the dust into gleaming cities of the future in 4 years, no less. Was pretty troubling. Plus, of course, I'm going to seize control of the entire civil service, and every single federal employee will be hireable and fireable at the will of the president. And another thing, I will also take over the direction of education from pre-K through postgraduate college work, and everybody will have to study what Donald Trump says they should study, et cetera, et cetera. And the whole question is, well, how are you going to pay for it? Because that's how serious journalists deal with anything. You say, how are you going to pay for it? And everybody scratches their head and says, the serious press has stumped them. Anyway, this is over at the Supreme Court side, its own branch of the government. They have their own article and in the Constitution and everything. And here's what Lithwick has to say. You can write that the Supreme Court is delegitimizing itself only so many times, which everyone has done, before you've made yourself ridiculous. I guess that's a byproduct of it, right? The whole point of writing about the Supreme Court delegitimizing itself is to make the Supreme Court seem ridiculous, but I guess eventually everybody says, you're ridiculous for saying it over and over again. If the High Court is not in fact behaving in a fashion that makes its decisions respected, the real question is, why are we all zealously watching and reporting on its decisions as though they are immutable legal truths? This is an interesting question to pose on top of the layer of analysis that of the Supreme Court that you get from this show, when Armando was on, when we recount things that Armando has said when he was on, our own opinions. Yeah, that's an interesting question, though, right? If the Supreme Court is being delegitimized, and if you're a reporter who says this is a hot topic, the Supreme Court is undermining its own legitimacy, well, then you would think if you really believed that when you reported it, why then the next day, and it's getting to be that time again, when the court ends its current session and releases all of its opinions, why are you going to bring out cameras showing you racing to the steps of the Supreme Court and then running out with all the paper and then trying to read it and interpret it on the air as though any of the decisions were serious? You've just spent a week telling us that they've lost their legitimacy, and then you are showing yourself on camera racing to read their every word and parse it. That's the sort of thing you would do with an institution that has legitimacy. But also, it's a very interesting, philosophical question, too, that we've all sort of been trained to believe that what the Supreme Court says the law is what the law is. But if you're also of the mind that they have delegitimized themselves, you can't hold both views simultaneously and take both seriously. That's an interesting issue. So, yes, ask that about the press. Why are we all zealously watching and reporting on Supreme Court decisions as though they are immutable legal truths when we know that they can change on a whim, right? Why are we scientifically analyzing every case that comes down as if it holds value? This is here's the transition from the previous. Why are you holding on to dollars as if they hold value while the United States has defaulted on its debt? That is the instrument that backs the supposed value of those pieces of paper. Why are you looking at them as though they hold intrinsic value? Why do you think that this $20 bill is worth more than this $1 bill, or indeed more than this coin, which at least has metal in it? And the answer is, I don't know. That's the training. And these numerals represent a value higher than the numerals on this piece of paper. Well, they're both the same size pieces of paper, and they use more or less the same ink on them, and they have the same intrinsic value unless everyone believes in the federal debt. And now that no one does, you just have a bunch of paper. And so do you, Harlan Crow, as a matter of fact. Now, he has some durable goods that he's purchased along the way that might have intrinsic value, although whether or not you can trade them for food is another question. Anyway, back to Dahlia Lithwick. Why are we scientifically analyzing every case that comes down from the Supreme Court as though it holds value? The obvious answer is that these decisions have real consequences, something the past year has shown us far too graphically. But if the Supreme Court is no longer functioning as a real, quote, court, why are we mostly still treating its output as if it were simply the law? I mean, like I said, it's a very philosophical question. If they're not acting like a real court, then why the deference? Why the belief that what they are espousing here is the real state of the law? If they tell you beyond all reason that, I don't know, let's say it's, pick a thing at random or pick something ridiculous at random. The anti-CRT laws in Florida, for instance, are real and true and valid and ought to be applied around the country, or, whatever it is, whether it's about abortion or mifepristone, or have I forgotten how to pronounce that or not, or did I remember unconsciously? And they say you can't have that. And yet instead you, walk into Canada, grab a couple of pills, use them, take them back, sell them to others, walk back into the United States. Well, the Supreme Court says the law is that, these states can have their bans and they can arrest you and treat you as criminal. And that's true. Those laws do say that. And then they show up to arrest you, but you meet them at the gates of your, let's say, breakaway ranch, with an armed mob that instead says, it's our AR-15s against your AR-15s, plus we have cowboy hats, and therefore everyone's going to cover the standoff that ensues, and we're going to get away with it, and maybe my children will run for Senate later on. Let's say, just to draw a parallel to a certain other outcome. And if they don't end up arresting you or whatever, can you say that the law really is what the court said it was? I don't know. That's a good question. She doesn't actually bring that up directly, but imagine that as underlying all of this. In some sense, now, Lithwick continues, the answer is that the Supreme Court's power and prominence is mediated by the journalists that report on the institution. And we as journalists rely on the court for legitimacy and prominence in return, right? Why are we reading Dahlia Lithwick's article at all? Because she is a noted analyst of things that the Supreme Court does. If it turns out, though, that she is a noted analyst of what Vermin Supreme does, and you're not interested in Vermin Supreme because you think he's a joke, you probably won't read Dahlia Lithwick on that subject. respect. There's this symbiotic relationship though, right? If we are taught to respect the court, then people who are experts on the court will be important to us. I mean, if we're that kind of people, like for instance, people who are really into professional basketball and nothing else don't usually much care about what experts about the Supreme Court have to say. They are interested in what people who are experts in basketball courts have to say. But if you're one of those people who believe in the importance of the Supreme Court, you'll believe that people who know about the Supreme Court are valued experts. Now, if it turns out they no longer know what the F the court is doing because the court is, off on its own and not valuing the things that you're supposed to value as a court, precedent and logic and legal reasoning, then I guess, for one thing, the experts' opinions are worth considerably less. But she's also, pointing out that people who wear the right uniform and appear on the right channels to tell us what the state of the law actually is are the medium through which we remain conditioned to believe that the Supreme Court is legitimate and important. So, kind of interesting. And you're not really taught to think of it that way. Like there's no, there ought to be. I mean, after all, we've been calling the press, the fourth estate that we've been calling them, right? I sometimes get confused about that. We borrowed that from the French, of course, but there ought to be, because there is this, semi-formal enshrinement of a fourth estate. Even in the American system, there ought to have been a Schoolhouse Rock all about it all the time, all along, but there isn't one, and we don't consider them part of government, and they're not. So, I mean, the fact that the press wields power is true. It's just not something we're formally taught about until probably, I don't know, at the very least, high school level, if not college level, political science and social studies. Anyway, again, I keep interrupting poor Dahlia here, and she's got something to say, and I would like you to know it. Now, right, so as we were saying, in some sense, the answer for why we treat things importantly is that the Supreme Court's power and prominence is mediated by the journalists that report on the institution, and we as journalists rely on the court for legitimacy and prominence in return. Someone has to translate legalese to the public, but the way journalists report on the institution, mostly by explaining the quote-unquote law, has set incredibly circumscribed boundaries around how the court's political activities are viewed. The Supreme Court Press Corps has been largely institutionalized to treat anything the court produces as the law, and to push everything else, matters of judicial conduct, how justices are chosen and seated, ethical lapses, push all of that off to be handled by the political press. That ephemera is commentary. The cases remain the real story. This critique of the professorial Supreme Court Press Corps, articulated perhaps most pointedly by David Margolick, writing in 2007 in the New York Times, is that those of us who cover the High Court mostly just sit around taking dictation, reporting on the justices' questions and oral arguments as if it's news, reporting neutrally about the contents of their opinions, and reporting the facts of the cases as presented to us by the Supreme Court. And I guess here a quote from Margolick: "Try imagining any branch of government, the White House, say, or the State Department, covered solely on the basis of public events and printed releases, with nothing about its inner workings. It's inconceivable." And that's true. And he probably does mean that, even though he does understand the meaning of the word. But that's essentially how the Supreme Court beat works. Reporters assigned there rarely venture beyond oral arguments, briefs, and decisions. Almost never do they stray from their cubicles. Part of this is perfectly sensible. The court makes most of its news through its opinions, and interpreting them, often heaps of them at once, on tight deadlines, is damnably, and maybe deliberately, difficult. Those who do it well are rare, and they have little time to spare. It was, at the time, a stinging rebuke to read Margolick conclude that no other reporters are as passive as Supreme Court reporters. That is interesting and true, right? Whether the problem was passivity or just a very narrow definition of the job is one thing, but he was emphatically correct to suggest that the long-standing tradition of covering the cases rather than the justices meant that, with few exceptions, there have not been a lot of folks in the SCOTUS press corps on the Clarence and Ginny Thomas beat. Almost nobody on the Dobbs leak beat. And aside from routinely reporting the fact of plummeting polling numbers, few court insiders on the legitimacy beat, with the notable exception of Politico's Josh Gerstein, who co-reported the Dobbs leak last year. Virtually all scoops about Clarence Thomas and his ethical breaches, Leonard Leo's golden spigot, the rich donor to Supreme Court Historical Society pipeline, Ginny Thomas's election disruption efforts, and the catastrophic leak investigation all came from enterprising investigative reporters, political reporters, and outsiders at Politico, ProPublica, and the New York Times. The court's shadow docket beat was largely invented by legal academics. It speaks volumes about the way the court has been covered that only in the past year have some legacy news outlets hung out help wanted ads seeking reporters to cover the court as though it's an actual branch of government and not the Oracle at Delphi. Do they say Delphi, by the way? They might. Okay. Well, that's a good point. For those tasked with keeping tabs on 1 First Street, Supreme Court, the beat has changed very little. What's happened in the Senate Judiciary Committee with the various court reform bills and with respect to extramural judicial conduct, that is still largely set aside. That is still largely set aside as we continue to perform the possibility that the High Court is operating precisely as intended. Under this theory, so long as the court hears and decides some number of cases every year, it's doing what it's always done. The political scientists are laughing hot beverages out their nose at all of this, but it's simply a truism now that if the court's job is to emphatically say what the law is, borrowing from the way they phrased it in Marbury versus Madison way back when, then it's emphatically the job of the beat reporters to merely write it down and explain what it means to the public. That's either because we are wizened doctrinal experts or because we have been institutionalized into submission. Either way, I was reminded recently that White House reporters missed Watergate. It was a DC crime beat scoop. That's true too, right? Good point. And helps explain what it is and how we find ourselves here. If it's true that those of us who do journalism about the High Court have become too hyper-focused, as Balls and Strikes founder Jay Willis likes to remind us, on a handful of cases every year. That is to say, we become too hyper-focused on that handful of cases every year, and not even all 70 cases granted, but the 10 or so that are predetermined as the big cases. Well, then the question is, why? Perhaps it's because they have, quote, good stories. Remember the cursing cheerleader? I do not, but I'm sure court watchers do. Cases that are fun and often easy to report. But that narrow vision also means we can miss the big shifts and trends in what the High Court is doing to this country. The SCOTUS should not become a national news story only after a justice says something snappy that goes viral at arguments. The best time to pay attention is not just during the last 2 weeks in June, but this is how the court has been covered historically, which is why we are living through a boom moment of outsiders gobbling up the scoops. They think we're sleepy junior varsity law professors who forgot to hold power to account. We think they're gossipy, low-information neighbors. But it's not just that we mostly settle for covering the cases. We further let the cases set the agenda for what we consider justice. If the 9 justices decide to revisit affirmative action and Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act and federal preemption around labor disputes, we'll then devote a year to debating both sides of these legal issues, regardless of the fact that they were supposed to be long settled. As long as the court thought it was a good time to breathe life into the major questions doctrine or the independent state legislature theory, we have considered the questions of that theory seriously, despite its manifest unseriousness. That is a good point, too. And once the Supreme Court started to invent its own facts, as it did in the Coach Kennedy case last term, remember the praying coach who said, I don't force anybody to pray, and I only pray on my own time. And he was praying at, halftime and pregame at midfield and requiring all his players to be out there, and most definitively was not doing the things he was supposed to be doing as a football coach, but claiming to the court that it was otherwise. Yeah, right. So inventing your own facts. I was thinking even more of the, the broccoli mandate things and the Cornhusker kickbacks, et cetera, et cetera. All right. Right. So, once the Supreme Court started to invent its own facts, the affirmative action, as it did in the Coach Kennedy case last term and in the affirmative action cases this term, and of course, 303 Creative, the case of refusal of service to same-sex couples, also this term. Well, once they began inventing their own facts, it began to matter urgently that the press would still routinely be covering cases as usual, and that's quote-unquote cases, scare quotes, even though these cases included wholly imaginary quote-unquote facts, or as in 303 Creative, no facts at all. Repeating manufactured narratives with which the court will eventually manufacture legal doctrine serves the court's interest. The problem is that it does not serve the interests of the public, and that's whom journalists are supposed to be writing for. Unfortunately, we somehow did not learn the lesson the public was forced to learn during the Trump years, that just because there's a red brief and a blue brief, this doesn't by necessity mean that they are two legitimate fact-based sides to an issue to which we must impute good faith. There isn't always some reasonable compromise to be found in the middle. Watchdog groups have proved that a good number of those briefs were bought and paid for by big money, riddled with bad science, and driven by an Overton window theory of the law. We have enabled the Overton window by forgetting that the story of what happened to the Supreme Court on Mitch McConnell's watch is as much a Supreme Court story as the manufactured narrative of 303 Creative, even if there will never be a 6-3 decision handed down about it. Years ago, I heard a marshal, a real Supreme Court marshal, tell a journalist that the first 2 rows of the press area were reserved for, quote, court employees, meaning the folks in the so-called permanent press corps. It occurred to me that our job in the press is to constantly remind the 9 justices that we do not, in fact, work for them. I wonder whether all the fury being directed right now by some of the justices at journalists comes from the kid glove treatment that they've come not only to enjoy, but to expect. In covering the court as though the justices were uninteresting and untouchable, did we reinforce a norm in which they now believe that any scrutiny is an attack? They certainly do believe that. After the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, which were accompanied by a non-existent official investigation into the legitimate claims that the hearings surfaced, I wrote about my inability to go back to the court. I felt that showing up there seemed to perpetuate the idea that every justice is the product of a functioning process. But the process was corroded. I covered it. The corrosion spread across the reputation of the court and also our ideas about what justice should mean. If reporting on the court doesn't include probing into who is on it, how they got there, and where little baby cases are hatched and who pays for their progress through the system, we are reporting on the output without questioning the input. And if that's the beat, we're doing only half of our jobs. So, how do we stop failing at those jobs? What would we do if we stopped covering SCOTUS the way we have for 2 decades that I've been at this? What if we were to stop covering SCOTUS as a breathless cult of personality, as if it was the House of Windsor? What if we broadened this beat from changes in doctrine to changes in justice? What if we looked at the whole story, money, influence, campaigns, Harlan Crow, and all? Some modest suggestions will follow. We'll have to keep them till after the break, but I guess because there's a little bit more music left, I guess we'll give you a taste of what some of the suggestions are. For number one, for instance, more longitudinal reporting. What happened in colleges in California after they did away with affirmative action? This is knowable. How do we make it the beat? Things like that, right? More suggestions from Dahlia Lithwick after this. Hi everybody, it's me, David Waldman. Yes, the same guy who interrupts you all the time. Interrupting you one more time, just to tell you again, another reminder that your contributions are what keep this show on the air, and patreon.com, patreon.com, is still among the easiest ways to make the sustaining subscription donations that keep us afloat. Are you ready for the pep talk about how our Patreon campaign is still going strong and growing? Well, too bad. Yeah, the plain fact is we actually are headed in the wrong direction, and whereas we once had about 175 monthly patrons, we're now actually down below 150. Time to recruit some more. Not exactly the kind of news I wanted to share, but there it is. For those of you in a position to support the show, patreon.com does make it easy to make those secure, recurring monthly contributions to do so. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. We've been through a lot together. The worst of the pandemic, we hope. The worst of the insurrection, we hope. So go ahead and treat yourself. You don't need an excuse. Give yourself the gift of a little something you enjoy in life. Support the show. And of course, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running on those options too. So thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We couldn't, or at least shouldn't, do it without you. Hope you'll be on board soon too. Thanks for all your support. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Roots Radio. The Dahlia Lithwick in the Morning Show today, anyway. So we left off just heading into her suggestions for how serious Supreme Court reporters who actually want to cover the totality of what's happening on their beat, rather than simply let you know what the court has written down for you. And translation is obviously necessary, but they could keep themselves busy with more. So the first suggestion, more longitudinal reporting. That is to say, tell us what happens in the aftermath, right? Okay, the Supreme Court does away with affirmative action. Well, what happens in colleges afterwards? Is their theory valid? Is there a different methodology whereby they promote diversity? Does it come to rise, and does it meet constitutional muster? Do they backslide into segregation essentially? What's going on? The answer is knowable. Why aren't we going out and knowing it and then telling people? What happens when SCOTUS ended race-conscious school remedies in the parents involved case? What happened 3 years later, 5 years later? Who owns that beat? Apparently it's not Supreme Court reporters, and one wonders why that's not the case, I guess. Actual people is number two. What are we talking about? She says, we're seeing brilliant near-daily coverage of how Dobbs has affected women's health care, the practice of medicine, and state elections this year. This kind of sweeping coverage of how law affects everyone should be a part of what we cover when it comes to guns, election subversion, LGBTQ plus equality, and the environment. Certainly true. I don't know how she plans to implement all of it. Maybe there's some suggestions later, but maybe it's more team coverage of things. And you say, all right, well, for the political reporters who are covering these stories, the outcomes in reproductive health care, for instance, bring a member of the Supreme Court reporting team along with you. Put them on your panel, run your stories by them, talk about what happened, and seek their input in your reporting. Well, let's see. Often in the last week of a term, she continues in this thread, we speculate about what will happen on the ground next. but this is knowable and it should be part of the beat. Next up, the institution of the court. Reporting on that needs to change. We need to better explain the nuts and bolts of everything we missed in terms of how the judicial conference operates, how the ethics canons work, why reforms were enacted and applied to judges post-Watergate, and why this apparently hasn't been enough to rein in the High Court. We should be covering clerks and the clerkship pipeline as part of the beat. They are a huge part of how power works within this system. It's not that stuff hasn't been covered. It just hasn't been covered by Supreme Court reporters. And I guess I'm sure that they read those things and they may or may not, but there's no obvious reflection in their reporting about how their knowledge and understanding of where Supreme Court clerks come from. And it is important because those clerks very often end up on the courts later on. But there's no reflection of an understanding of that in the reporting of the cases because that isn't in the paper. We were asked to read the paper and tell people what it means. Well, sometimes what it means is, don't forget that a lot of this stuff was written by people who are clerks and not the justices themselves. It's read and approved and, tinkered with to some extent by every justice. Obviously, no clerks are simply writing the things and then passing it off as the writings of the justice. But, who's really writing these things is a part of the story. It's unknowable perhaps which clerk did it, but then talk about all the clerks. There's a limited number of them. Go ahead and do it. We should be covering clerks and clerkships and the clerkship pipeline as part of the beat. We've gotten bits and pieces of it from other reporters, of course, who've told us about all of that, including the stories from out of, was it Yale Law School, where we were talking about people who were advising top students about how to get clerkships up to and including, the length of skirt to wear when you met with certain federal judges to increase the chances you would get a federal clerkship, and then later on perhaps a Supreme Court clerkship, as that pipeline fed you toward that direction and you started writing all of these opinions or contributing to the writing of all these opinions. And you got there based on the skirt thing. I mean, there's more to it than that, right? You have an intellectual capacity, but who are you? Where did you come from? And why you versus the other genius? Is it, and did it have anything to do with the skirt? Let's find out. We should better explain things like the Supreme Court Historical Society and how it came to be a locus of fundraising to gain access to justices. We've heard the stories. Yes. Supreme Court reporters have read the stories. I know that they have. They must have. It's very interesting to them. Has it been reflected in any of their reporting about the outcomes from the opinions? No, it has not. It'd be hard to know how to hammer that in, but maybe Supreme Court reporting needs to reflect the other suggestion, which was, that mainstream reporting be colored by the inclusion of a Supreme Court reporter on the team. And likewise, the Supreme Court coverage team needs the reporters who have covered all these other angles to have a chance to weigh in. Throw in a paragraph in the story about this weird outcome from a weird case that sets a new precedent or turns something on its head, and say, by the way, this was likely written by some very strange people who made their way to the court in very strange ways, including things that would involve a lot of Leonard Leo's direction of Harlan Crow's money. Explain it. Point it out. Next up, judicial confirmations. Why are they covered chiefly by political reporters? What are the purposes of these hearings? What should the purpose be? How do court watchers play a role in shaping that conversation? What can we learn about the ways in which whatever happened at a hearing shapes doctrine for an individual justice? That's an interesting question too, but yeah, that should be part of the picture. Especially given now that, for one thing, if we're going to continue to pretend that the province of the court is, emphatically to say what the law is, and they're going to have legitimacy, and these 9 people get to say what the law is based on their opinions, literally, then we probably ought to be paying attention to the fact that now the only safe play to get yourself on the federal bench and later on to the Supreme Court is to come to a hearing. The one chance there is at accountability for these federal judges or federal judge wannabes depending on whether they're coming fresh from outside or just moving up on the bench. We ask you, all right, you get to say what the law is based on your opinion. I now want to know, what are your opinions? And the answer is, I don't want to tell you my opinions. I don't answer hypotheticals. I don't want to talk about something that might come before me as a member of the court. And somehow that has passed muster and become like the official endorsed answer for these questions. Everything is going to be decided. The direction of the country is going to be decided on your opinion, literally your opinions. You are actually going to call them your opinions when you give them. So I'd like to know something about your opinions. And the stock answer is, I'm not going to give them to you. I'm just not gonna. Not only that, but it's also become an accepted part of, to borrow Greg's name for just about everything, an accepted part of the kayfabe of, well, what are your views on abortion? Well, it's settled law. Well, but aren't you all about, isn't the long-term project here to put you in a position to say, well, my opinion is that there ought not to be abortion, and so therefore that's what the law is. That answer to that question is yes, of course. Everybody knows it. It's been spelled out that way for decades. So your opinion on it is, I'm not going to tell you. And we all say, he's not commenting. He's not answering hypotheticals. He said he wasn't going to answer hypotheticals, and then he didn't. But, the job is to give your opinion. What's your opinion? I don't know. I don't talk opinions. I wouldn't want to color my, that's actually a kind of a huge part of covering the Supreme Court beat. Every single one of them at this point is there because they gave the correct answers that allow you to bypass any insight into who they are and what they're going to do with the law and why they're doing it. So the Supreme Court, just an enormous black box of a collection of 9 people about whom we're apparently supposed to know nothing, even though their opinions are what tells you what the Constitution means. That's kind of weird and crazy when you think about it. Next up, questioning the conventions of Supreme Court coverage. Why can't we have video? That's a damn good question at this point. Why can't the press office answer questions on the record? Why is a justice's health not a matter of public concern? I think that actually is, but we're told that it ought not to be. This list is paltry in part because I sometimes believe I myself am so institutionalized that I experience the end of the lemon test. And here it's court lingo, and you got to know what they're talking about. And offhand, I don't, but she's linked something here. Okay. I sometimes believe I myself am so institutionalized that I experience the end of the lemon test as the beginning and end of my reportorial beat. But the vast machinery that has bought and built the present court is as much a story as the output of that court. More so, perhaps. So, we are thinking about it in no small part because we should be held accountable for failing to report our stories, like Harlan Crow's judicial vending machine operation. We should be held accountable because it is the media's prerogative to treat this court like any other institution that has players, rules, and motivated operatives. We did a dismal job reporting what happened to Kavanaugh's debts, stipulated. But we would like to do better. And that is the aim of this package. This is our attempt to broaden the scope. But we're also here to listen. Tell us what you think. Okay, that is pretty interesting. And a lot to think about. And sort of an existential question about the press. I'm kind of interested in the link of the lemon test here. What's she talking about? Because it didn't ring a bell for me. And it links to her own article along with Mark Joseph Stern from back in June of last year, 2022. Neil Gorsuch to non-Christian kids who don't want prayer in public school. Get over it. That, of course, down to the Kennedy case that she mentioned a number of times in the previous article. The Supreme Court handed down another 6-3 decision collapsing the separation of church and state last year, ruling in favor of more sectarian prayer in public schools. Kennedy versus Bremerton School District asked whether Joseph Kennedy, a high school football coach, had a First Amendment right to pray with students at the 50-yard line after games. According to some teammates, this practice coerced players into joining and practicing Christianity at school for fear of incurring the coach's disfavor. Nonetheless, Justice Neil Gorsuch's opinion for the court found that Kennedy's school violated his rights when it asked him to pray in private. So, what's the Lemon test? That doesn't get answered in the first paragraph and means I'll have to do some scrolling. Or probably, really, at this point, it's going to mean that you're going to have to do some scrolling. Oh, there it is. I found it. The Lemon test is, and this too is linked, is, I guess, overruled or stomped into non-existence by this case. And tell us what the law was and what it is now. And Stern says, I think it's safe to say that the Lemon test is overruled because Gorsuch says it's already dead. He says the country didn't know it, but we quietly overruled the Lemon test at some stage in the last 20 to 30 years. I'm not going to pinpoint when, but trust us, it happened. And now we have to open another list. Lemon test comes from the case Lemon versus Kurtzman. That's actually someone's name. It's Alton J. Lemon and others. A case decided in 1971. And the question at issue in the case was, do statutes that provide state funding for non-public, non-secular schools violate the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment? The conclusion by an 8-1 decision in favor of Lemon and the Lemon party here is that yes, the Chief Justice Berger at that point delivering the opinion for the 8-0 majority as to the Pennsylvania statute and 8-1 as to the Rhode Island statute. The court held that a statute must pass a 3-pronged test in order to avoid violating the Establishment Clause. The statute must have a secular legislative purpose. Its principal or primary effect must be one that neither promotes nor inhibits religion, and it must not foster excessive government entanglement with religion. The court held that both the state statutes in question had secular legislative purpose because they reflected the desire of the states to ensure minimum secular education requirements were being met in the non-public schools. So a complicated case, I guess, of sorts, but not complicated in terms of the decision. 8-0 and 8-1 with respect to these two different statutes. But I guess the point is that a court's decision or near unanimous decision in 1971 about the nature of the separation of church and state when it comes to funding and religious activities in schools, some point a unanimous decision overturned by the Supreme Court, and Neil Gorsuch in his opinion says, I don't know where or when, and I can't point to anything in particular, but it's just this sort of vague feeling, which I guess is fair game given that the terms of what the law means comes to us in the form of what is labeled opinions. And again, these 9 justices get to give their opinion. In my opinion, that thing that happened almost unanimously in 1971 is not worth anything anymore. I think we've, in my opinion, gradually moved away from that, and not only gradually moved away from it, stood it on its head. And we now no longer believe this thing that we used to unanimously believe was the state of the law. When did it happen? Not sure. What cases led you to believe that? Couldn't tell you. Do I have to tell you? No. All I'm supposed to tell you is what my opinion is. It's become your expectation that I would provide citations, but if I don't, this is still my opinion. And as Dahlia Lithwick points out, well, if people in suits are willing to go either on television or go to the newspapers and magazines and say, this is his opinion, and in this country, opinions mean something when they come from the 9 Supreme Court justices. Never mind that he told you that he was totally into precedent and settled law. Never mind that he wouldn't answer questions about this when he was asked in the one chance we had at auditioning him, vetting him for the job. He said he wasn't going to tell us because it was a hypothetical, yada, yada. Now it turns out that this is his opinion, despite the fact that there's nearly unanimous Supreme Court precedent from not that long ago, well within the living memory, the working memory of many people who cover this court, that says the opposite. Now it's the opinion of these people that the opposite of what the Lemon case said obtains. We asked why. They said, we're not going to tell you, but they did it in robes. We're wearing suits. We told you that the robe people said that's out. That's all I can tell you. The magic of the court is that, there's no appeal from them because the Constitution says so. And now that thing that you thought was the law, you were all, what do I always tell you about this stuff? It turns out you were all pre-wrong about it. If you went to law school sometime after 1971, but before 2022, you learned that the state of the law is thus and such about the separation of church and state and the use of public funds for non-public sectarian education. But it turns out that conservatives have always wished it was the other way around. And now that there are 6 of them on the Supreme Court, their wish is your command. Everything you came to understand about public funds for religious education and the presence of religion in public education is wrong because now 6 people are of the opinion that their wish about the way it really should be is more important than the wishes of a previous unanimous court from 1971. And my God, 1971, that's practically, well, not really all that long ago at all. So, I don't know. She makes a good point, and that ought to be part of the story. And it very rarely is, as it turns out. So, okay, that was well worth spending a lot of time on. It really was a lot of time. There's some other stories, of course, bubbling up here. And, now that I've mentioned, some legal issues, I guess we could stay on that topic. That's tangential to this. But we mentioned the other day, the work going on in Oklahoma and in Florida and in other states, the idea of forcing the state to, as the Republicans would put it, stop doing business with quote unquote woke banks and financial institutions, right? Anybody that has any diversity programs or that, has any sort of, method of evaluating, investments that they make, particularly if they handle public, pension funds or whatever other, whenever a bank or financial institution handles money, that belongs to the state or is administered by the state. If they are taking into account environmental factors and social factors in social responsibility and, or diversity or what have you, when they make their investment decisions, that's woke and they're out. We're no longer going to allow them to handle our money. Instead, we're going to hand it over to investment institutions that are willing to toe the Republican line. And by the way, therefore, donate much of their profits, perhaps, back to Republican candidates, perhaps as an explicit part of the agreement, for all we know. But in the meantime, it also happens to mean that the fossil fuel industry, other things that are otherwise perhaps disadvantaged by the investment strategies of these so-called woke banks, are able to demand that the state funnel that investable money back into their industries. Kind of a weird thing, right? So a fossil fuel producing group that finds itself at a disadvantage because ABC Institutional Bank says, we actually think the future is in renewables and solar, and we would like to invest that way. The big oil interests, the fossil fuel interests, can say, that's too woke. And that's a trigger word for the Republicans. And where the Republicans run the state government, they say they can convince them, these banks are too woke for you to do business with. You need to do business with banks that are going to invest in non-woke industries like ours. I want you to tell the institutional investors whose job it is to predict the future the best they can and find where the big profits they think are coming from in the future, that no, the big profits, we think you should think that big profits are coming from our sector. And if you don't, you're too woke and we take the money away from you and give it to people who will agree to give it to us. So what's the basis for all this wokeism anyway? And all of this idea that perhaps investments ought to be steered in a different direction. I happen to have an article here from The Guardian from the other day, Monday. Isabella Kaminsky's article from the 22nd. Big polluters, and here we have one of those possessives here with the S apostrophe. Big polluters' share prices fall after climate lawsuits, multiple study finds. This is an exclusive, although I think you probably could have figured it out yourself, but they've done the writing exclusively. Fossil fuel companies register drop in value after litigation or unfavorable judgments. You'd think that would, I think you could probably figure out the economic principles behind that. If a fossil fuel producer has been sued and is found liable and has to pay out billions of dollars to somebody somewhere, and you're evaluating their stock price, you would probably say, well, I would pay a little less than I would have paid last week. Now that I know that billions of dollars are going to exit the company, I mean, those billions of dollars were going to exit the company anyway and end up in individuals' pockets, but nobody ever figures that in for some reason. But they're going into the pockets of the people who don't have any, say, financial interest in the continuation of this concern. So there's a migration of dollars, if there are such things as dollars anymore. See our debt ceiling crisis. But an exit of value from the company, and it's going elsewhere, and it's not likely to be reinvested in the company because it's not going to people, it's not going into pockets that would be perhaps likely to repurchase shares in the company, but rather to take their money elsewhere. You could have guessed that. You probably did. And if you were an institutional investor and you said, I'm not even investing in this company, I don't know, but I guess if you ask me, the future share price, at least in the next quarter at the minimum, since that's what we measure everything by, probably going to drop. And if it's going to drop because there's this exodus of capital from this company because of the lawsuit, well then, at a minimum, I can't say that this is a long-term poor investment, but for the next quarter, perhaps we should be putting our money into something that I think there's reason to believe will be going up in price, right? That's actually doing your job. You're performing your fiduciary duty here. I'm investing the pension funds from this teacher's retirement fund in this state. I think solar's on the way up. I think fossil fuel's on the way down. Not because I'm woke, but because I saw that the fossil fuel producer in question has just been sued and lost $1 billion. I'm going to invest in the company that didn't just lose $1 billion. I don't know where they're going. I don't know what direction they're headed, but I know where they're headed. They're headed $1 billion south, right? I'm going to vote for investing in the company that I have at least no indication of the exit of $1 billion anytime soon. I think they'll at least hold steady. I think a lot more people are buying solar stuff. I think they're headed up. Let's invest there. That's not wokeism. That's economics. But because the money is going to solar, which is woke, they actually convinced the Republicans in the state legislature that to stop doing business with those banks and start doing business with banks that say we're investing in the people going south. Why? Because we're the ones really doing the fiduciary duty. They're really not. And this study says so. Climate litigation poses a financial risk to fossil fuel companies because it lowers the share price of big polluters, research has found. Also, effing common sense has found. A study to be published on Tuesday by LSE's Grantham Research Institute examines how the stock market reacts to news that a fresh climate lawsuit has been filed or a corporation has lost its case. The researchers hope their work will encourage lenders, financial regulators, and governments to consider the effect of climate litigation when making investment decisions in a warmer future and ultimately drive greener corporate behavior. Not because it's woke, but because it's worth more money. That's the real driver here. The study, which is currently being peer-reviewed, analyzed 108 climate crisis lawsuits around the world between 2005 and 2021 against 98 companies listed in the U.S. and Europe, and it found that the filing of a new case or a court decision against the company reduced its expected value by an average of 0.41%. The stock market responded most strongly in the days after cases against carbon majors, which include the world's largest energy, utility, and materials firms, cutting the relative value of those companies by an average of 0.57% after a case was filed and 1.5% after an unfavorable judgment. Although modest, the researchers conclude that the drop in the value of big polluters is statistically significant and therefore down to the legal challenges. We didn't know before if the markets cared about climate litigation, said Misato Sato. That's a repetitive sounding name, but anyway, he's the lead author of the study. It's the first evidence supporting what was suspected before. I mean, it was a pretty good thesis, right? That polluting firms and especially carbon majors now face litigation risk in addition to transition and physical risk. And that's on top of everything else. All right, I'm way behind on playing the outro music, so we might as well get started. But I just thought I would bring that up to you in case there was any doubt. I mean, I think it was probably pretty intuitive to you why there was an economic case, not a woke case, but an economic case for investing in clean energy, renewable energy versus fossil fuels energy. But now there's quantifiable evidence, and you can say, I can now predict with some certainty about how much I think will be lost in value when one of these suits is filed, and of course when and if negative verdicts from the point of view of the fossil fuel producers actually come in. And we can basically take a look at that. We know when the verdict is about due, and maybe ahead of time, even if we haven't divested from this once the case is filed, we can divest once it looks like it's moving to a verdict based on how we think the case is gone. That's doing your fiduciary duty. Instead, directing people to put the money back into those companies that are headed for a 1.5% loss on average, not doing your fiduciary duty. They should be fired from handling state pension funds. But instead, Republicans are mandating that the funds go into the hands of those people who are saying, I am going to invest poorly and I know it, but I am going to invest in myself. That's not a great idea. Probably ought to be stopped.
Netrootsradio.com. You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
All right, time now, of course, to listen to Justice Putnam and the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy coming up next right here on Netroots Radio. What's he got on tap for you? Okay, after gerrymandering the hell out of the state, Ohio Republicans are now trying to change century-old state rules to keep abortion rights off the November ballot. You know about that. Scott told you.